Anytime soon. Ken, stick with us for 1 second because I want to bring in Naveed Jamali. He is a former FBI double agent. He's the author of How to Catch a Russian Spy. Naveed, good to see you. What do you expect out of tomorrow's hearing?
I agree with Ken. I think that they're going to have to address this claim by the president that essentially there is a wiretap. But the danger with that is exactly as Ken is saying, in that the FBI has sort of been painted into a corner where they, by either admitting it or denying it, they're essentially admitting or denying that there's a larger investigation. And as you know, just from a law enforcement standpoint, they don't like to admit that investigations are going on until they're ready to present something. So I think Comey's going to do a lot of fancy footwork, and I have to say, many of us are probably going to be left wanting in terms of some of the larger questions. But I think we will absolutely, as Ken said, get a direct answer about the president's claim of a wiretap. I
have to ask you, Naveed, you have been invited by the Senate House Intelligence Committee, to speak about your own experience with Russian intelligence. What's the point you want to make most? What are you going to say?
Well, look, when I look at Russia and when I look at how they do this, there's always this idea that Russian intelligence focuses on actually stealing information. And in my experience, what I found is that, no, that's part of it. But really what the Russians are often after is, frankly, buying people. And when you look at Flynn or Roger Stone or any of these other sort of associates, and the question of did they have contact with Russia, I think that there may very well have been a two-pronged part to this attack. One was to mess directly with our elections, but the second was an entree by the Russians to try to get into the Trump inner circle. And now that doesn't necessarily mean that those people they contacted were doing anything illegal, but I certainly think that there was a concerted effort to try to make contact and, in fact, potentially manipulate people.
And so the consequences there, Ken, does that square with what you're reporting and the information that we have at present?
It does, in a sense, but the interesting question, and Naveed's the expert on this, is whether, even if that happened, whether there will be criminal charges emerging from it. And if not, then what happens? Presumably, the Congressional Intelligence Committees still conduct a thorough investigation and will be able to tell the American public at the end of the day whether anybody in the Trump campaign colluded with this covert operation to destabilize our democracy, essentially.
Naveed, do you want to respond to that?
Absolutely. No, Ken's right. Again, it's worth noting that, look, foreign contact with even intelligence officers, even with an attempt to recruit someone, it happens quite a bit. It happens day in and day out. That act does not necessarily rise to the level of something that's illegal, nor is it necessarily something that should be prosecuted. The question is, did these people, as we saw with General Flynn coming back and saying, after the fact, registering as a foreign agent, did these people, once that contact happened, did they follow the proper protocol and report it? And if they didn't, that is something that is a concern. And potentially, if they hold a clearance, that is something that may, be elevated to the level of, looking into it for something that could be prosecutable.
I want to play another piece of sound here because Schiff's colleague, Adam Schiff, who we heard from this morning, Will Hurd, a Texas Republican, he's also a former undercover CIA officer, offered a very different take on Russia's role. Let's all listen to that.
Grisly step. This is how the intelligence community refers to the Russian involvement or attempts to manipulate our elections. It's going to go down in the history of Mother Russia as the greatest covert action campaign, not because President Trump won. There was no manipulation of the vote tallying machines. It's going to go down as the greatest covert action because it created a wedge, whether real or perceived, between the White House, the intelligence community, and the American public.
Naveed, what's your response to that?
Absolutely. I think that is, at its core, that was Russia's primary motivation. Look, they want to destabilize us, but also they just want to make us look weak. And it's not so much that the audience necessarily was the American people, but it very well could have been former Soviet states. There's a large push in Eastern Europe to join NATO and things like that, and that terrifies the Russians. So I think that a large part of this was to say to those countries, look, American democracy, the democracy that you aspire to become, the NATO that you want to join, may not be what you think it is. And I think that was, look, that may have been in part a large motive of what they did, of why they did what they did.
You hear a lot of Republicans saying that the biggest issue here isn't President Trump's claims about wiretapping, but instead the leaks of classified information. Ken, what's your take on that? Is there some truth to that?
Well, obviously there have been a lot of stories about things that have been classified, but as an intelligence reporter, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, that's my job. I make my living from that stuff. So, but going back to, Will Hurd, he's a former covert operative in Pakistan. He knows exactly what he's talking about. I completely agree with that. I mean, look, we are tied up in knots over this as a nation, and look at what it's done to the credibility of the President of the United States. I mean, he contributed to this, obviously, but this whole issue, how are folks going to believe President Trump if he has to address the nation and talk about a strike on North Korea now based on intelligence that he's seeing from the intelligence community that he's now been in a fight with and that he's questioned, the veracity of? It's just the Russians, if that was their aim, they certainly appear to have succeeded, Jacob.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Naveed Jamali, Ken Dilanian, good to see you both. Thanks so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
Coming up, how the